went to 0 for some reason. So I'm rebooting and reconnecting. Okay, we're there. I'll try and pop that back up. It was a very heavy cloud. I think it must have actually affected signal must be right on the edge.
She's going to be leaving here tomorrow.
Oh yeah, they almost went dark. Connect to the we have short 4 minutes. I might swap backwards in a little bit. Come on. Oh, hang on. Could not start live session. Just see if it'll connect now, and then you can have a go in a minute. I don't see why it couldn't. 246, 312. It's not very much.
Sorry?
Can you see a picture?
There's traffic.
Well, it'll be a fairly scrappy one.
Along with the cable, there's traffic.
Oh no, they're not 52 children. I wonder if I could move. I'll move the Wi-Fi unit. Yeah, it's getting up to 600. I think you need at least a meg, don't you?
What I'm hoping is soon at some point overnight ship to shore.
4, 5. Why is it so so there's more and more people here using Wi-Fi. I could connect to the phone. I'll keep working on it then. All right.
Yeah, it's Eric. Eric's a person.
allegations of racism within the royal family.
I don't think you go on and on and on, as Elizabeth did, by worrying about the headlines. I think she was always absolutely focused on her duty and her service.
And duty would soon call again, this time in the form of the global pandemic. More than 150,000 people lost their lives to COVID-19 in the United Kingdom. The Queen evoking Britain's wartime spirit and speaking of a world united in common endeavour.
We should take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again.
The Queen spent much of Britain's lockdown at Windsor Castle with Prince Philip. But in the spring of 2021, after 73 years of marriage, she lost the husband she described as her strength and stay. He was 99, his death a reminder to the nation of the Queen's own mortality, people mourning both for her and with her. She emerged from mourning, a little smaller, a little more fragile looking. But the golden thread was still there, and wending its way inexorably towards the next milestone. This one, platinum. Elizabeth marked her 70th year on the throne February 6, 2022. And in June of that year, the nation came together to celebrate her Platinum Jubilee. The famous Mall was again draped in Union Jacks and plump with well-wishers. Shops full of anything and everything relating to the Queen, corgis included.
Good evening, Mr. Bond.
Good evening, Your Majesty.
They'd made an appearance in a video for the Diamond Jubilee a decade earlier, along with the James Bond of the day and featuring the Queen herself.
I do hope you're having a lovely jubilee.
This time, it was Paddington Bear's turn, offering up an answer to one of the great questions of the Queen's reign, just what she'd been keeping in her purse all those years.
You would like a marmalade sandwich? I always keep one for emergencies.
So do I. I keep mine in here. For later.
But the Platinum Jubilee was also notable for what the Queen did not do, absenting herself from some of the key events, other members of the royal family stepping in. Earlier in the year, Prince Charles read the speech from the throne for his mother for the first time. It was a nod to the inevitable changing of the guard to come, however unthinkable for some.
We all in some way knew her. This huge figure, this sort of massive oak tree that was on the horizon, is suddenly felled. So I think actually we're all bereft.
The sheer longevity of Elizabeth II's reign is partly what embedded her so deeply in the fabric of the nation. With her passing, Britain's test going forward will be to maintain its sense of identity.
This is, of course, the Prime Minister speaking on the death of the Queen.
Responsible, ambitious, and extraordinary country we are today. As her 12th Canadian Prime Minister, I'm having trouble believing that my last sit-down with her was my last. I will so miss those chats. She was thoughtful, wise, curious, helpful, funny, and so much more. In a complicated world, her steady grace and resolve brought comfort and strength to us all. Canada is in mourning. She was one of my favorite people in the world, and I will miss her so. C'est avec une grande tristesse que nous apprenons aujourd'hui du décès de Sa Majesté la Reine Élisabeth II. Elle était notre reine pendant presque la moitié de l'existence
Almost
du Canada.
half of Canada's existence,
Elle avait une affection
and
évidente,
she had an obvious and deep and abiding love and affection for all Canadians.
avec force,
She served us with strength and courage for 70 years.
pendant que nous sommes devenus le pays
As we
ambitieux,
became
optimiste,
the ambitious,
diversifié,
optimistic,
responsable,
diverse,
extraordinaire que nous sommes
responsible, and extraordinary country that we are
aujourd'hui.
today.
En tant que sa 12e
As
Premier ministre
her
canadien,
12th Canadian Prime Minister,
j'ai beaucoup de mal à accepter que la
I
dernière
have
fois
trouble
que je l'ai vue
accepting
sera la dernière
that the
fois.
last time I saw her would be my
Ces
last.
conversations vont me manquer énormément.
The conversations I had with her will be terribly missed.
Intéressante,
She was a
engagée,
thoughtful,
curieuse,
wise,
drôle.
curious, and funny
Elle m'a
person,
beaucoup conseillé, beaucoup
and
aidé.
she gave me a great deal of
Dans un
wonderful
monde
advice.
très compliqué.
In a complicated world,
Sa présence, sa grâce,
her steady
sa
presence,
force
her grace,
a
and
été
strength
une ressource importante pour nous tous.
brought comfort and strength to us all.
C'était une de mes personnes préférées au
She
monde.
was one of my favorite persons in the world,
Elle me manquera énormément.
and I will miss her dearly.
So that was Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaking as Prime Minister, but also clearly as a man who first met the Queen as a little boy and knew her throughout his life. As he said, he was her 12th Prime Minister. I'm finding it interesting, if I may, to listen to, we are talking about, the most public of people, but there are the most personal of stories emerging, whether it is people sending tweets directly to me and to all of us here at CBC with the photos and memories. They are also calling us. People, for example, someone saying, I worked a luncheon for the Queen in the 80s at the Royal York. I wanted that job to be able to see the Queen up close. I will always treasure that memory. People are talking about being as little kids, watching them on one of their many tours. Remember, the Queen came to Canada some 22 times, 23 if you count the one time she came as princess. So it's interesting how public and yet how personal all of this can be. Even though the relationship with the monarchy is complicated, even though some people are not comfortable with the idea of a King Charles, I'm finding it curious how many people are writing us, and please keep doing it, with the stories of your personal connections. Would like to go now back to Ottawa. CBC's chief political correspondent, Rosie Barton, is with us. Hi, Rosie.
Yeah, and I mean, the Prime Minister's statement sort of reflects what you're talking about there, Adrian. Not only a recognition that this is a new chapter for the country, for this country, for the Commonwealth, for the world, but also a very personal statement from someone who had gotten to know the Queen, both as a small child and as an adult, and had come to respect what she was able to offer as the head of state, saying that she was thoughtful, wise, curious, and funny. I mean, I found his last line, that she was one of his favorite people in the world, quite touching, and really saying quite a lot, given how many people that the Prime Minister has met and knows. I will tell you, we also have some other reaction coming in at this hour, and I want to say this part too, because it also is deeply personal. The Governor General, Mary Simon, of course, Canada's first Indigenous Governor General, talks about how the Queen was compassionate, dedicated, humble, engaged, and wise. But then she goes on to offer this personal story as well. She says that when she was growing up, her grandmother revered the Queen. Of course, Mary Simon is Inuit, as did so many in the Arctic. She would tell us stories about Her Majesty, about her role, and about her commitment. And that too shows you that, there are, of course, your stories about your professional relationship with people, Mary Simon now, the Governor General, having met the Queen, but also personal anecdotes that span a long, long time, given that she reigned for so long. The leader of the official opposition, Candice Bergen, at least for the next couple of days, there's a new leader to be named on Saturday by the Conservative Party, also expresses condolences to the royal family, talks about how the Queen was a witness to our historical evolution as a country, there to open the St. Lawrence Seaway, for instance, and that many will say her passing marks the end of an era. We're going to hear more from other prime ministers as they also react. Possibly Jean Chrétien later in the day will have comments that he can make on camera, but Paul Martin, the 10th of the 12 Canadian prime ministers under Her Majesty, also has put out a statement. He was there and hosted the Queen back in 2005. And he talks about how the Queen was deeply inquisitive and keenly informed, that she was good company. And again, another personal anecdote, which really tells a story here about what kind of person she was, that when they met and they spent time together, that the Queen mentioned his father and his mother, because Paul Martin Sr., of course, served as Canada's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom in the 60s. So a story, I think, of someone whose duty to her country and to this country was real, but also marked people by her charm and her ability to remember all those personal relationships, which is actually the sign of a very good politician, Adrienne.
Rosie, thank you. Thank you very much for that. We will keep an eye. I gather, Rosie, too, that the bells are not ringing in Ottawa because they've been under construction.
That's right. Normally, the Carillonneur would be ringing out the bells of the Peace Tower. The Peace Tower and the whole of Centre Block is shut down for the next 10 to 15 years. So that is not something that will happen. I believe the flag will go down if it hasn't already. And there will be other ways to pay tribute to the Queen here on Parliament Hill. I would point out that there are still banners, not flags, but banners up all along the front of Parliament Hill that had been put up to mark the Queen's Jubilee. Those flags will remain in place for now, but there will be other ways that that Parliament and this country will, of course, signal that the Queen has passed.
All right, Rosie Barton in Ottawa, thank you very much. Just as you're looking at the right of your screen there, of course, you are joining us for a CBC special about the death of Queen Elizabeth II at the age of 96 years old, 70 years on the throne. And this connection to Canada is so very strong. She visited this country more than any other nation, some 22 times as Queen, once as Princess Elizabeth, and once in her imagination as a little child who had been introduced to a log cabin built in one of the royal parks by the Canadian Forestry Corps by her grandfather, the King, who she referred to as Grandpa England. When he introduced her to that and explained the story of that little log cabin, in her mind as a child, she thought she was in Canada. So she called herself Miss Canada, and she would invite Grandpa England for tea to Canada. So when we count the Queen's trips to this country, as either Queen or Elizabeth, we're going to call it 23, just to add that one for her imagination. I wouldn't mind going at this point to David Cochrane, who is in Vancouver. I gather you are seeing some black ribbons, correct, David?
Yeah, that's right, Adrienne. You've seen black mourning ribbons now have been handed out or being worn by members of the Prime Minister's cabinet and some of the political staff. Not surprising given the somber moment that we are in, and certainly that emotional statement we just heard from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. You could hear the emotion in his voice when he got to the part of his statement where he said, "Canada is in mourning. She was one of my favorite people, and I will miss her so." And just speaking to the longevity of her reign, she's been the Queen of Canada for almost half of the country's existence. About 45% of Canada's existence, Queen Elizabeth has been the head of state starting in 1952 until now. And Rose, Adrienne, it's interesting you're mentioning that everybody's calling in with their stories about the Queen. I remember a story when I was back working as a reporter in Newfoundland, and the Queen came there to tour in the late 1990s, and she visited a business called Purity Factories. They make these legendary cookies back home called Jam Jams and peppermint knobs and this cherry syrup people get at Christmas time to put in ginger ale. And as she was going through, the Queen with her hat on and the white sort of coat, because it's a food production facility, she stops to talk to a woman who worked in the factory, and she said, "And what are you making here?" And the woman looked at her and said, $12 an hour, Your Majesty. It was sort of the highlight of her trip to St. John's, for the arrival of the Matthew and going back to the discovery of Newfoundland, or by the British, a settlement by the British in the late 15th century. So the one Queen story that sort of sticks out from one of her many visits to Canada included a visit to Newfoundland and Labrador in the late 1990s.
What a fabulous story, $12 an hour. I think she probably enjoyed that very much. David, thank you very much. We're just getting a message from Clarence House, which of course has been the home to Prince Charles, that as King Charles, he will now be known as King Charles III. So we are moving from what Andrew Pierce refers to as the Second Elizabethan era. He is referring to her now as Elizabeth the Great. That's just Andrew Pierce for this moment, but I certainly understand the sentiment. And we are moving into the era for the UK and the countries within the realm of King Charles III. That's going to be hard for people to just change your mind and change your language a little bit around that. I wouldn't mind now, if we can, please, connecting with the former Governor General David Johnston. He joins us by phone. Sir, I know you have extraordinary stories about the Queen. How are you doing?
Well, a sad day for all Canadians, but also a celebration of a remarkable person. I think history will not produce a similar leader for her times. And we both mourn her passing, but we celebrate the great legacy that she's given to all Canadians. And
do you have a favorite story?
Oh, there are many. But, you know, the story I think that's most important to me, Adrian, is she epitomized the concept of the leader as servant, something that goes back certainly many, many years and decades back. But it's so essential today that people who lead our institutions do them with a great sense of serving the public and the public interest. And she epitomized that, I think, more than anyone we could possibly imagine. And that, to me, will be such an important legacy, duty, honor, service. And I would say faith. Her faith was a rock for her. And it was a faith, of course, that was rooted in Christian theology and values, but it was a universal faith. And, you know, all of the great religions of the world at one point or another had the notion of regard for the other, love thy neighbor. And her favorite parable in her Christmas messages, which were so inspiring, was the Good Samaritan, the biblical story of the Samaritan from a hostile tribe to the Israeli people, what, 2 millennia ago. And he was robbed and left lying in a ditch. And of course, one of the leaders of the Israeli community, a Pharisee, came by and ignored him. And then the scribe came by and ignored him, people from his own group and the elite. And then a Samaritan who came from one of the enemy or hostile tribes came along, and he looked at this man and came over and looked after him, bound his wounds, and left him in an inn to be cared for until he was whole. And that was her concept of love thy neighbor, not simply the person that is part of your family or your kinship, but the people, all people who need your care. And I think she lived that so well. I have many, many favorite stories. I guess one of the stories of graciousness was, it was the 60th anniversary we were celebrating at Government House, Canada House in Trafalgar Square. And there had been a ceremony, and they were going out down the red carpet of the steps that led from Government House, Canada House, to the Trafalgar Square. And there was a wrinkle in the carpet at the second last step. And I was about, perhaps a foot behind her, and lo and behold, her foot descended towards that wrinkle in the carpet, and I had great visions of her stumbling. And through my mind, I knew, of course, you don't touch the Queen, but my mother's voice, I think, was speaking with me and said, if you don't take her elbow, my son, I'm going to disown you. So I grabbed her elbow, and fortunately her foot landed properly, and she moved on. And the next morning, the British tabloids had great fun with this colonial bumpkin grabbing the Queen. We had a message from her private secretary shortly after that saying, please advise the Governor General that it's great to know that chivalry is alive and well in the United Kingdom. That's the Queen and her graciousness.
That is an excellent story. Can you imagine the headlines had you not extended a gracious hand and the poor soul had fallen? You would have been in big trouble.
I must say, that flashed through my mind as well, Adrian, in that sort of mini-second when you had to think of what you had to do. But thank heavens for my mother's voice.
Indeed. Sir, please extend our hellos as well to Sharon. We remember hearing the stories of your visits, the pair of you, to Balmoral, and the shoes that the Queen kindly shared so that those muddy walks could happen comfortably.
So those were great stories. That was a wonderful weekend we spent with them actually before we were sworn in at Balmoral, and we were so struck by their graciousness and their informality. And as I left, she said, "I do read letters, you know." And I said, "Well, Your Majesty, I will write to you, and when they become dull and boring, I shall cease and desist." And I've written about once every 3 to 6 months, and I actually sent her a letter a little less than a week ago, just bringing her up to date on the Queen Elizabeth Scholars program, which we started to mark her 60th anniversary of Platinum Jubilee, Diamond Jubilee on the throne. And it's just absolutely flourishing. Over 3,000 young Canadians and international students coming here, all working for global citizenship. And that was, I think, such a part of her reign and her influence, as well as young people getting to know one another and crossing geographical boundaries, language boundaries, cultural boundaries, and working just for friendship and the resolution of conflict and living together harmoniously. The Queen Elizabeth Scholars Program is a very appropriate tribute to her.
Excellent. All right, sir, thank you very much. That's David Johnston, who served as Governor General from 2010 to 2017, the 28th Governor General in Canada. We'd like to bring in now David Onley, who's the former Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, and we've reached him today in Toronto. Sir, I'd like to start with what you're thinking about right now.
I'll follow up on what the former Governor General said, and that is the remarkable sense of service that she had and the actual execution of service. It was baked into her DNA. You know, I had the great privilege during my term of office to have her visit the Lieutenant Governor's suite at Queen's Park, and as people went, as she went through the office and met many people, the process was that she would stop and she would engage in conversation with them, and the people who met her came away changed, if you will, because she had said or done something with them that really moved their spirits. And it was amazing afterwards, the number of letters that I got from individuals who had their own stories to tell, condensed perhaps from the longer opportunities that myself and the Governor General and many other and prime ministers, what moving words the Prime Minister had a short time ago. But the individuals who only met her for 15 or 20 seconds or 30 seconds were clearly moved by the experience. And it was that engagement with individuals, and as you alluded to moments ago, that memory that she had of previous meetings, as you referred to Paul Martin, the former Prime Minister, and his father. Things like that were just part of her very nature. And I think over the years and then the decades that just touched so many people, as has been alluded to, the fact that there's just an ever decreasing percentage of people who can remember in Canada, who can remember anyone other than Elizabeth as their monarch. You have to go back really to the Depression generation of people coming of age in that time, and then serving in World War II, who would have any memory of anyone other than Elizabeth in any meaningful way. So for decades and decades of service, and not just to the people of Great Britain, but to Canada and to the entire Commonwealth, she has been a constant presence, and so this is why we all feel touched today.
Okay. That was, thank you very much. We appreciate that. That was David Onley, the former Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. I want to bring you some details about what is about to happen here. So we now know that Prince Charles is now officially known as King Charles III. He could have chosen any one of his names, Charles, Philip, Arthur, George. And that at this point, once he is proclaimed the king, the national anthem will change for the first time since 1952 to God Save the King. There are more details like that that will be emerging over the course of the next few days. None of these are a surprise per se. That doesn't mean they aren't a little bit jarring, because they are different from the world most of us have come to know. So for some of those changes and some of the latest details, I'd like you to hear from Arthi Paul right now. Arthi?
Yes, Adrian, you know, part of this sort of carefully constructed plan and protocol that we're seeing play out right now, it's really been in place, and you've been discussing this for the past 60 years. Some of it, of course, has been tweaked with technology, with the advent of social media, with the way that broadcast has changed, a focus more on the internet instead of radio and television. But certainly we do know that this is an Operation London Bridge. That is what it is called. When a monarch, when Queen Elizabeth specifically passes. And this, again, these plans have been laid out for decades. So part of these have already, we've already seen these come forward in terms of the sharing of this news. There's a key time frame, approximately 10 to 12 days, that we see a process happen. So how will people be informed? Well, the day itself is referred to as D-Day. The Queen's private secretary is the one who actually notified UK's Prime Minister, also the Privy Council. That is how that news was shared with these key figures. Commonwealth leaders had been notified, and we saw, of course, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, for example, issue his statement, and other Commonwealth leaders have also issued statements after being notified in this way. News flashes have been sent, official notification of the Queen's death. We saw pinned to the palace gates a very simple statement indicating, of course, also that King Charles III, as we know, will be his name, and the Queen Consort will be in Balmoral at least tonight and then come down to London tomorrow. And of course, we know that King Charles takes over, King Charles III. He is now the head of state for the UK and for the Commonwealth. The royal family website publishes a statement. These are all part of what we see happening. In terms of flags being flown at half-mast. That happens across Whitehall. Now, that's a street in London stretching from Trafalgar Square to the Houses of Parliament, a site of the main government offices. And, of course, that's something that we've already seen happen across the board. So some of these are steps that we've already seen happen. And part of what we see in terms of this coverage, too, that pilots, in fact, also will inform passengers if the news breaks when they are, in fact, in the air. So these are all part of the pieces that have been carefully constructed, choreographed as how people will learn of this news. So we've seen that already. What happens going forward? Well, we know that King Charles III will be coming to London with the Queen Consort. We know that there will be funeral plans that will be made in the coming days. The nation has entered a national day of mourning. There will be a 2-minute national day of silence, or 2 minutes of silence, rather, across the nation. And then we'll learn more about the funeral plans and procession. There is a royal train, a very special way that the Queen will be transported now to London. And of course, we know that ceremonies will take place at Westminster Abbey. And so these are all part of the details that we're learning now. Many of them will be conveyed, as we've seen already, through the royal family, through the account which is publishing on Twitter. Again, that is a change from when these plans first came around in the 1960s. But the Queen's funeral is typically held 10 days following news of her death, and she's expected to be buried, or at least there will be a memorial or ceremony at St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Those are some of the details we know right now that have been laid out and in place for some time, but of course we're learning more as the day comes. And King Charles III, who will ascend to the throne, and there will be a coronation for him too. That will take some time. That is not expected to happen quickly following the news of Queen Elizabeth's death, but that is something also that we'll look in the long term that we'll learn more details about, Adrian.
Arthi, thank you. Those details are really important. Really appreciate you digging those up, because we're going to see a lot of these things happening over the next little while, and it's important to understand this protocol. You are looking at a nighttime picture of the flag at the top of Buckingham Palace. It, of course, has been lowered just outside the palace on a beautiful British, it's still summer night, where the light goes down significantly later than it does in most parts of here in Canada. We are coming up to, I think, if my math is right, 8 p.m. In the UK. People have been gathering somewhat slowly. It's thickening at Buckingham Palace. It's always an interesting thing, though, because there's actually nothing for them to do there. They're beyond that tiny framed announcement on the gates of Buckingham Palace, as they are sitting on the gates of all the other royal houses and royal palaces. There's nothing to see and nothing to do, with the exception of being together. And I think we all know, and it is basic human nature, that when something happens, you want to gather. You need a hearth of some kind, and that is where people are gathering right now. Those streets will thicken. Those streets will most assuredly thicken in the days to come, as that royal train moves from Balmoral up in Aberdeen down towards London, and this operation, both London Bridge and Operation Unicorn, which is the name of the operation when the Queen dies, as she did in Scotland. These details you will come to see in the days ahead. We are also seeing other flags changing. I think even at the CBC, I'm not sure if we have this picture, but if we do have it, there is now a Union Jack. There it is, flying outside the CBC. That is also protocol. And so I think you're going to see a lot more of that happening in the days to come. Let's go back inside that building, though. There you go. That is Ottawa as well. Let's go back inside this building into our newsroom, which is not that far away from where I am now. I'm coming to you here from the National Studio. Bonnie Brownlee is in our newsroom. Bonnie, what are you learning about what is coming?
Mostly just for the family sort of preparing themselves now, and the children, the grandchildren, you know, as they all, over the next 24 hours, depart back to London and start to get themselves ready for all the services and things that will be coming up. I'm hearing a lot from Canadian friends that are in the UK, how emotional they're finding it on the ground. And even as Canadians that are expats that are living there, how struck they are by the quietness that's going on and the gathering around Buckingham Palace. You know, it's such a symbol of hope and civil society for a lot of people, and that balcony is what we've been watching the Queen from, you know, for 70 years. So for a lot of people, there's just this emotional tie to go to a place that sort of represents that sense of, you know, of government to some extent, and civility.
In Buckingham Palace, I guess some of the early pictures are of a young Princess Elizabeth gathering there on VE Day. That amazing story, Bonnie, of how she and her sister just sort of tucked out. You know, they just secretly asked do you think maybe we could go out and see what that feels like? Yeah. And I think with some sweating royal protection officers, they were allowed to go, and they danced and coursed through the streets, and were probably in a thick crowd for, anonymously largely, for maybe the first and only times in their lives on that extraordinary day on VE Day in 1945. That palace is where birth announcements are made.
Everything.
Everything, as you say.
And I think they snuck out more than once.
I hope they did. I hope they did.
Well, they were young, beautiful women, and with a lot of weight on their shoulders, big responsibilities at a young age, and you know, trying to find their way in this life of service. And they could share it, but only so much of it could be, you know, sharing for two sisters. So it was, you know, they had their own spunk, and they had their own sort of excitement for being, you know, teenagers and young women. And so they had to find their own outlets as well. And it was a little easier, frankly, then to do it than, as we know, stories of Princess Diana and Sarah Ferguson tried to do it a few times and they got into trouble. So time changes.
It certainly does. And you talk about the relationship between the Queen and Princess Margaret. I think what a strong and I mean, they had each other, and they sometimes only had each other. And it was, I think it was just some 6 weeks after the Queen lost Princess Margaret, am I getting the timeline right, that she lost her mother?
Her mother. Yeah, like that. And you can imagine, you know, they were very close, the three of them, no matter what they had been through, especially for the Queen and her sister with the marriage issues and, you know, who she was dating and all of that. They still remained very close friends, and they could actually share a lot of secrets together. And the Queen could speak to her sister about pretty much anything. And they did that. And sometimes their conversations were only on the telephone. They weren't necessarily in person all the time, just because of travel and the lives that they both lived. But you know, two siblings, it's a small family to all of a sudden have your life changed when you're a young married woman. You know, it's quite a terrific story, actually, how the two of them sort of did a lot of this venture together.
Indeed, indeed. Bonnie, thank you very much. We will get back to you throughout the course of the day, probably days plural. Just one little tidbit I just want to on-pass here. We know that William and Kate, because of what's happening here, will get new royal titles. So they will now be referred to as the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and Cambridge. They'd previously been known just as the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, but they've now taken on the roles that just a few hours ago were reserved for Charles and Camilla. It's a little thing, perhaps, but also on a day like this, the protocol machine just keeps kicking in. I am